Driving us through a wood, my father makes out a stag between pines in the mist. He pulls over for us to observe. I ask him to take a picture. No, he says, just look and remember. Remember for the rest of your life. My aunt. Your mother was madly in love with your father when they were first together. She would call me during visits to his house and tell me how amazing he was, how he grew sunflowers. She doesn't tell you about that. Seiche, a phenomenon that occurs within a confined body of water, such as a lake, sea, or pool. Once disturbed, the enclosed water may produce a seiche, or standing wave, that moves across its surface or, when below, between the warmer upper and colder lower layers. The wave does not break.
Thank you so much for those totally awesome poems and getting us started. I so enjoy your work. So the first thing I want to talk about is the title of this book. I mean, there's kind of two titles working. How did you arrive with this title? And I think it's a good lead into how one should read the book.
This was actually two books at first, and the Playing Monster title is actually from a really specific diary entry that I include that my mother wrote about me playing monster. The Seiche title kind of happened when I was doing a lot of research about lakes and water, and I was trying to think of a title for that book, because again, that was a separate book. And then I found out about this phenomenon, and it seemed to really perfectly capture this feeling of dread, of this kind of active motion that feels unending. There's no kind of cusp or end. It just keeps going and feels, at least to me, kind of like threatening.
How did you make those two worlds come together? The world of the wave, the world of family trauma. Yeah. How do those connect in your brain?
The Playing Monster book was my MFA thesis. And while I was also in my MFA, I kind of started what ended up being the Seiche book. At that point, it was called The Lake Was Perfectly Calm, which was actually a line from one of the found text pieces in the book. And my mentor at CalArts was Maggie Nelson, and Maggie, in my exit interview, was basically like, I feel like these should be one book. And I was like, no. I don't know why I was so, I think particularly with MFA theses, and you probably know this too, you have this like real sense of like, this is my book. It's, it's like, this is the first one. And so then I was, kind of sending them out, and I was getting nice responses, but it wasn't really coming together in terms of just like publication happening. And so I asked my dear friend, Carmen Jimenez Smith, she and I worked together at Noemi, and where I also edit poetry. And she read them, because I basically was like, maybe these were just books that I needed to write, but that doesn't mean that they should be published. Like maybe there's something in this process of my art making that ultimately isn't about getting out in the world. And she also said that they needed to be one book. And I was just like, oh no, in part because, you do all this work and you think, okay, I have two books, these two books will happen. And then suddenly it's like kind of collapses all the labor into a single book. And so I was kind of belly aching about this with my friend, Robin Costa-Lewis. Also, this is really illustrative of how every book has a village behind it, right?
Yes.
And so I was complaining about this to Robin, and she said, well, you know what they say, if 3 people call you a horse, it's time to buy a saddle. And so I was like, oh God, okay. And she was totally right. And then I had the supreme privilege of also having Sarah Vapp as a friend, and she was really willing to work closely with me in kind of weaving these two together. I like to call her the doula of the book. I think that I would have given birth to it fine, but it probably would have been much more painful and maybe not as smooth. So essentially, the Playing Monster thread involves these very spare reportage poems just describing instances of the domestic experience that I had growing up, as well as found text poems from my mother's diary, in which she kind of just describes nice things about us, her children. And then the Seiche poems are found text poems from late 1800s New York Times articles about this particular lake near where my mother lived in central New York, as well as these kind of like wispy, more lyrical pieces where I describe actually mostly like fire and water, as well as the situation that my mother was dealing with regarding a really aggressive neighbor and another really aggressive man, like these men in her community who she didn't really know, who started to stalk or kind of enact different things of aggression, like walking on her property and doing things that they shouldn't, kind of saying menacing things to her. So essentially, the idea that I was trying to create in terms of how these two came together is through these chronological leaps and these different forms, whether it's found text or whether it's, you know, my own poetic creation of my own words, how they kind of, these threads kind of vibrate with each other, and the ways in which I think particularly with abuse narratives, there's this common arc, right? Where someone is in an abusive situation, and they somehow extricate themselves and ride off into the sunset and everything's fine. And statistically, that's not how that works. And, you know, I think in particular with my mother, she had 4 small kids, and was in an abusive situation. She was also a colleague of my father. You know, it's very messy. And she managed to extricate us and herself without anybody getting hurt, which is a statistical miracle, right? And then also was able to kind of do this equivalent of ride off into the sunset. We moved across the country from Arizona to central New York. But I think the kind of more recent thread, why that feels important, is to illustrate how you can't really escape abusive situations only because the structures in place that foster abuse and aggression are still there. So even though, you know, she managed to get away from this one person, she's still dealing with menacing men.
It also shows how grief stays with you and trauma stays with you.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that's most exciting to me when I was revisiting this text is that you found so many different entryways into it, from being docu-poetic to being kind of the more lyrical confessional poems, to the eco poems about the lake, to the noir poems, and then also, as you've been talking about, the found poems, whether it be New York Times articles or the speaker's mother's diary. Mm-hmm. So I was just, again, how do you arrange this? How do you sequence this? I mean, it really reads like a thriller, like it's a cliffhanger. It's really, really awesome. How did you achieve that effect with craft?
To have 2 threads in which people are in danger and to kind of jockey between those inevitably keeps a reader wanting to know what's going to happen, particularly when one of the characters is in both, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm in both, my siblings are in both, but like particularly my mother, right? She's in both. And like, what is it when it's like 20 years later or 15 years later and she's still kind of having to deal with being afraid in her domestic space?
So those leaps through time, I think, do so much. And I think also the way that the text plays with opposites like that, like you've talked about the water and fire, and then even those two, there feels William Blake talked about no truth unless in contraries. Yeah. And I feel that really rises up within this text as well. So I was wondering if you could read some of the poems that show those contrasts between the kind of emotional states.
So this is from the Safe section of the book. At twilight, a man approaches my mother's gardener. He is yelling at the gardener about cutting the peonies, trespassing on private property. The gardener believes the neighbor is drunk. But your wife gave us permission. My wife would never say that. She would never, ever say that. The gardener describes the exchange to my mother. She grows worried. I'm not worried, he says. I have my shovel. Arizona. It is a place where all that lives has hardened and bristled against the world without. It is a place where a man can beat his wife and daughter, and then his second wife, his son, and 3 daughters, then his third wife, without reckoning. I remember the red winds of a storm, desert-shocking hail on a field. We are all pelted and bruised on our backs, wind hurting us against fences. Through our cries, I hear the laughter of my father, his face red, terrifying, the storm, the very cracks of his teeth.
For confessional texts, sometimes we want the emotional intensity. We want the speaker right there within it. And this text eschews that kind of moves. And I was wondering if you could talk about that aesthetic choice and why do that? Why tell it in this way? Why witness it in that manner?
I've heard this said a lot. It's better to write from the scar, not the wound. I'm finding myself more and more as actually writing from the wound and then editing from the scar. And mostly because I really like to kind of pin down images or emotions as they're happening that sometimes are harder to access later. And I can just put that nuclear document in a drawer and not touch it for however long. But with these, I thought that this was a scar. I don't know if it was or it wasn't, but it did feel like I was kind of rending something and documenting whatever came out. So I think for me, one of the big things I think about a lot is that poetry of witness, which is what I think this book is, illustrates the power of witnessing. And particularly when you feel that you have no recourse in a situation, right? You're completely disempowered. I was a kid, right? I couldn't get in a car and go away. But at the same time, I could remember. And I think that that's why that first poem that I read feels like a really important poem to open the book with, because in some way, my father was giving me a directive and I listened, but not in the way that he wanted me to. So in a sense, I am able to kind of make a case for the abuse that he enacted.
I want to talk a little bit about the lake poems and talk about the way that they haunt the text, just like the trauma of the speaker and her mother haunt the text. And then also that they are a literal grave site, documenting and bearing witness to that as well. And also kind of function low-key as eco poems as well. I mean, what ain't this text doing, right? What isn't this text doing? Seriously, so much props. But yeah, could you talk about the lake poems a little more directly and maybe read some of them as well?
Yeah, of course. So when this was 2 books, the Seish book was much more explicitly an eco-poetic text. It had a lot of found text from more recent articles regarding the fact that this lake has been polluted to a really remarkable degree. It's a Superfund site. It's dangerous to be there. And of course, this is a colonized space. This was a really important resource to the indigenous populations there. Actually, really recently, the Onondaga Nation has sued to try to get this property back. This is the site in which several nations came together with Hiawatha and became the Onondaga Nation. So it's this, there's all this terrible trauma there. It just took all this pollution, but then also did kind of these acts of aggression of making it so that people couldn't be there, or poisoning, the same community that, or whatever, the people who later lived there, their progeny, who proactively harmed it. So to me, it almost felt like I was seeing this thing kind of grow and become something almost sentient. And, learning about feminist eco-poetics and how that's so grounded in issues of land as this place of conquest, particularly by white men, for so long. And similarly, my mom kind of having to deal with these acts of aggression from strangers, strange men, and the impact it was having on her feeling afraid to go for walks around her neighborhood, being in her home. She didn't really feel like she could move in a similar way that the lake couldn't really move. But on the flip side, it was I felt like the lake was actually able to do something about it, about what was happening to it or happened to it. I feel like a lot of this book is really interested in the landscapes, which are so opposite, growing up in Arizona and then also being in central New York, this place that is defined by its heat. and then this other place that is defined by its snow and lack of sun. So I think kind of trying to create those landscapes for the reader felt really important.
I'm really, really compelled by this idea that the lake is kind of an empowered version of the speaker's mother. That is so compelling, of like taking all the kind of angst and then throwing it back. And it almost feels that that could be almost kind of like a plea for the speaker of wanting the mother to be able to stand in that space.
We are all creatures who inevitably absorb difficult things or trauma, right?
Yes.
And I think some of us can handle it differently than others. But I think in the way that, this is actually something that I'm kind of trying to write about now, but this idea of like the body as an archive of what happens to it, and the mind as an archive, which feels more obvious, but I think of this like body of water that essentially is just absorbing attacks to its ecosystem and health, right? For a very long time. So,
just as women so often are, right?
Absolutely.
Like for both cultures, like
Yeah.
the most like important and crucial part of society, yet the part of society that's mistreated the most.
Essentially the way that my mother could try to protect herself was to just be very still, right? And like not get attention. But to kind of link it more to the lake, link her more to the lake, I think that they were both entities that absorbed a lot of trauma of different sorts, and had different means of dealing with them. My mother rises early to walk the dog, though the dog can no longer make it up the hill. It is winter. It is dark. Suddenly, my mother sees a man in clean camouflage and a headlamp in the road. It is not the neighbor. It is a different man. She continues walking. They pass each other. Your dog is quiet today, he says. Interlude. Found text dated 1877 describing events near my mother's home. A monster in Onondaga Lake. He and his son were fishing when surprised by the sudden appearance of a monster. It swam along the surface for several rods, then sank out of sight. Fire. The beauty is in the blue of it, that dangerous shadow around her, barely visible, licking its fingers.
So one of the things that I'm also really drawn to about this text, and we kind of talked about it also, is that like it doesn't just say, oh, I'm healed, or oh, this is all over, trauma, we just put it over there and now it's done, you know? And we've talked about the way that it can repeat like a wave coming in, the way that it can kind of be the body, and I love this as well, you saying this, a quotable, the body being an archive for trauma. Like,
Yeah.
My goodness, what a turn of phrase. But I wonder, what does poetry do when it comes to these kind of things? Of course, we have the great Audens quote when he's, memorializing W.B. Yeats, saying that poetry makes nothing happen. We have Frost, before that, saying that poetry is a momentary stay against confusion. We have Lord saying poetry is survival,
Right.
something that I more kind of espouse, I think both of us.
Yeah.
But what does Diana Arterian say? And what does this text say about like what poetry can do when it comes to being cathartic and when it comes to trauma?
I mean, I'm definitely agreeing with Lord. I think, one of the things that she says in Poetry is Not a Luxury, she focuses so much about how structures of power specifically work against feeling, and yet feelings have survived.
Yes.
I remember the first time I read that, I burst into tears. It was just so powerful and gave me a sense of permission for the power that I felt with poetry. As wonderful as it was to get nice reviews and other things like that, the most remarkable thing to me was just the emails from strangers who felt really seen and grateful for the work. So I think that alone illustrates the power of poetry. I also just think about more generally the fact that oppressive governments work really hard to silence poets. I can list many poets who were killed or tortured or imprisoned because of their work. I think it's pretty clear that poets have a really remarkable power and importance in society as a role. And I know this is something I think about a lot, and now this was a while ago, but when the Chilean miners were stuck for 2 months or something.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was writing poetry. And I think that so illustrates like its value for this, I don't want to say the soul, but like for something within us to use it as a mode of expression. I mean, it's the oldest form of creative art that humans have other than probably painting. Like it's thousands and thousands of years old. The power for me with the book was the fact that, you know, my father was somebody who worked really hard to protect a certain image, despite all of the terrible things that he was doing to the people I love most, even just professionally. And as a kid, as I mentioned before, it's like you don't really have a sense of recourse, right? You feel very powerless. This is somebody who wielded an incredible amount of power over 5 really remarkable people. And anybody with $17 in 2 hours can now know all of his darkest secrets. And so that to me feels really empowering on the other side of this entire process, right? Of like surviving being his child in his home to, you know, being an adult, and especially like a relatively young adult in my early 20s, kind of trying to describe what I had gone through and fully understand, oh, this is abuse and others can recognize that. And so similarly, receiving recognition from others and then also getting those emails from strangers who are just expressing gratitude, and also feeling seen by the work. I think it's pretty clear that poetry's power is real.
What a clapback for you to say for 1750, you can now get all of his B-sides. And I think that really gets to, you know, to stay in the pocket with Lord, like Litany for Survival, right? Yeah. And at the end, you know, that's why it's better to speak, because we were never meant to survive. And I think that this text shows that precarity and the power that can be found within that precarious space. And I love that. I love that. But what else is going on? I mean, this is heavy, so heavy, but I know that also you ain't stopped scribbling. The party hasn't stopped.
No.
I mean, you're still an archive of trauma. You're still an archive of all the genius things that you think. So what's the next project and what you got coming next, my friend?
I hope what the next book of poems will be is about this ancient Roman figure named Agrippina the Younger, who's somebody who's largely known by the men with whom she's connected or related. So, you know, she was Caligula's sister. She was Claudius's niece and wife, which was weird even then, and also Nero's mother. So all these emperors. And yet we know very little about her, despite the fact that she clearly had a really important role in the early Roman world. And essentially, this book has been really useful to me as just an artist, because I realize that the kind of topic that continues to come to me, and I'm thinking of this M. Norbesse Philip quote that I'm probably not going to remember properly, where she talks about, for every artist, something chooses you. And for her, it's language, and for me, it's power. And I think that this book is, I mean, it's very personal. It's about my family. It's about all those things, but it's also really about power. And the Agrippina book, similarly, you know, this was a woman who desperately wanted power. She was in this oppressive patriarchal society, and yet seemed to maneuver, you know, the narrative of her is, oh, she murdered all these people and she had sex with all these people and that's how, blah, blah, blah. And I think maybe to some degree, but truly she was somebody who was able to get into a position where she could use men as prosthetics to run the Roman Empire, and became the most powerful person for, you know, a while. Nero had her assassinated, her son, when he was the emperor. And one version of her death is that he had her assassinated and then he had her cut open so that he could see the womb where he came from. And this violence that was so particular, or I want to even say like the violence that is so explicitly about the matriarchal, like the maternal body. I mean, he also apparently, I mean, all these stories about him are how crazy he is, or I shouldn't even say crazy, just like how power influenced him in this way that was really disturbing. So I wrote this first poem sometime after that And I did a bunch of research for it. And then suddenly I fell into the well of this, what became a book. Agrippina the Younger. Nero had her cut down, the middle to see, the womb that formed him. And as he peered in the cleft, that exposed organ began to pedal outward, growing and deepening to an enormous vagina, until when he looked in, he saw only darkness. So he burned prisoners in his garden for light and shut her up behind a large carving. Her remnants quietly broke off, moving into Nero, Piso, Vindex, Galba. So there were hauntings and blood and exile and suicide. Nero shept sea urchins, plucked songs on his lyre, and she continued to grow until it held all of Rome, which burned and was rebuilt, while it tessellated, fanned, and Agrippina smiled with her mouth of bloody eye teeth.
I feel as though this next project is another project of recuperating a female voice that has been relegated. And honestly, I feel like, your mother is just as powerful as Agrippina. So that's where I think we should land. Thank you so much for your time.